are the best bosses in Liurnia? Well, there are quite a few repeats from Limgrave, so let's run through those bad boys real quick. Deathbird, still really weird and don't really know what he has to do with Elden Ring. Deathrite Bird, Deathbird that has somehow obtained magic, also really weird. Black Knife Assassin, slightly better version than Limgrave, this might have promise, stay tuned for that. Erdtree Burial Watchdog, another boss that has somehow obtained magic, also still not a dog. Cemetery Shade, slick aesthetic design, interesting class cannon build, not a fan of the random skeletons. Tibia Mariner, still just as hilarious and amusing as the Limgrave version. Erdtree Avatar ×2. One of the better repeat bosses, dodging his massive hammer is pretty satisfying and good practice for new players. Knight's Cavalry ×2. Originally I hated this boss, but after a few encounters and getting used to torrent back combat, it's grown on me quite a bit. A nice change of pace. Glintstone Dragon Smerog, essentially Flying Dragon Agheel, except with magical breath to suit Liurnia rather than fire breath, guards the Academy Glintstone Key. Bell-Bearing Hunter, easily the best repeat boss, really well balanced, tough but fair, satisfying to master. I'm sure we'll hear from him again before the final credits. And our first unique entry for Liurnia is Adon, Thief of Fire. The size differential makes for a bit of a comical encounter, perhaps not intended, however. He has a few interesting pyromancies, but never creates enough pressure to worry the player to any great extent. He might have been helped out by some more active melee to intertwine with his casting, creating more of a sense of urgency on the player. Alabaster Lord, another weak Evergaol boss, this lanky magic user casts a nice array of meteor-based attacks. They're all fairly avoidable though, and when he resorts to melee, he legitimately just stands there sometimes, as you can see in this ending sequence. As with Adon, some tweaking to make him more aggressive would have created a more interesting encounter. Spiritcaller Snail, a boss reminiscent of Alana, the Squalid Queen from Dark Souls 2, except, you know, not nearly as good. Honestly, it's not terrible, the concept falls flat as the snail itself doesn't do anything while you fight the hologram, whose cover is blown by the personal health bar over his head. This fight could have been better by telegraphing the projected nature less, otherwise why not just make the knight the boss instead of having the Spiritcaller spawn projections? Royal Revenant. I'm not the biggest fan of bosses that simply thrash all over the place in lieu of having a more defined moveset. Although I would imagine some of you that like a more fast-paced, action-oriented boss might enjoy this fight. I will say he does mix melee with a poison spit attack as well as teleport around the room for quick combat that keeps you guessing. Not a bad boss, but one that doesn't necessarily play to the strength of the mechanics of Elden Ring. Boles Carrion Knight. The Evergaol bosses in Limgrave were three of the best in the region and a really cool concept, but unfortunately the encounters took quite a step back design-wise in Liurnia for whatever reason. Boles is essentially a field giant that you've fought many times up to this point, who happens to be wearing a Carrion Knight helm and has a homing magic attack. He does drop the great blade phalanx that he utilizes, so at least that's something. Crystallion. I'll definitely give this one points for creativity and uniqueness, but in writing and now voicing these entries, I've noticed a common theme amongst the weaker bosses in that there is no sense of pressure or urgency they really put on you to make split-second adrenaline-filled decisions. I'll be the first to tell you a great game has a wide variety of bosses, but many of the less than thrilling encounters all seem to have this quality, as does Crystallion, as amusing as the fight may be. Dual Crystallions. We might as well continue on with our Crystallion friends with this encounter, which actually builds quite nicely on the first battle. There's a nice combo of our spear and staff friends as they create a balanced ranged and melee dynamic, something many of the previous bosses on this list drastically call out for. They could still do with having the pressure turned up a bit, perhaps by giving the spear Crystallion a wider variety of melee attacks. I guess these are mini-bosses after all, so they do serve their purpose. The arena has an intriguing castle entryway as the backdrop, along with a couple of statues for cover, which differentiates it a bit from the rest of the dungeon arenas. Omen Killer. One of the best settings for an open field boss in the game, as the village of the Albernorix truly feels like a place where some creepy omen shit went down, as evidenced by the hanging bodies and eerie atmosphere. You can even summon our friend Nefeli for this fight. Once the intimidation factor of him leering over his perch wears off, he actually has a fairly limited moveset that is pretty dodgeable, along with some fire breath that can get you, but doesn't deal massive damage. Not the most difficult, but very well conceptualized. Magma Vermicar. While the dungeon and field bosses for the most part don't hold a ton of lore, at least not much that is explicitly told, Magma Verm's scale sword reads, "It said these land-bound dragons were once human heroes who partook in dragon communication, a grave transgression for which they were cursed to crawl the earth upon their bellies, shadows of their former selves." That being said, Mr. Makar here could have done with a bit of a wider moveset. As you venture to the top of this mine at the end of Liurnia, you expect something a bit more grand and well fleshed out. He has some swiping melee attacks and drops a bunch of fire, but that's really it. Maybe FromSoftware has such a high boss standard it's hard to compare sometimes, but I thought there'd be something with a little bit more uniqueness to it in this location. Cleanrot Knight. As someone who loves PvP, I really admired this knight's creative build. The fight taking place in a poison pool, along with his ability to inflict scarlet rot, which is totally broken in PvP by the way, is sure to irk a lot of players, but this helps create a sense of urgency and adrenaline in the battle that many of the early entries on this list are sorely missing. Status afflictions aside, his excellent mix of offhand spear, main hand sword, and magic added in make for the full gamut of attacks. And we haven't even discussed his sweet, beautiful armor yet. Look at it, it's damn magnificent. Unfortunately, I didn't find out about this fight until I was way too over-leveled for the contest, but even with that, this was a phenomenal boss and surely one of the best dungeon bosses in the game. In retrospect, I could have just used a non-strengthened weapon, but what can you do? Royal Knight Loretta. While this is technically a retread of the Tree Sentinel, there's enough new information that it warrants a unique entry. I'm not sure where this text is pulled from, but it is noted the Eternal Guardian of Caria Manor fervently defends her domain atop the royal moon-gazing grounds. Loretta uses her great bow to rain destruction on all who would dare approach the estate grounds. Drawing her great bow back upon her trusty steed in the moonlit pool is majestic indeed. Where previous bosses on this list fall flat, such as Adon and Alabaster in the Everjails, Loretta's aggressiveness and casting variety is tuned up to a level that makes the fight have less dead time and more perpetual action, while still leaving more than fair enough windows to attack and dodge. Not to mention that magnificent Tree Sentinel soundtrack booming in the background. Alecto Black Knife Ringleader. This is probably the entry I'm most curious to see how everyone else would rank. I can see people either loving or absolutely despising this boss. As I alluded to in the Limgrave video and earlier on this list, before this point I had thought the Black Knife encounters had potential to be great if they were scaled up to 10. Well, this encounter was scaled up to 1,000 as the Ringleader has an absolute mountain of HP, insanely strong defense, and 2 separate attacks that sap the majority of your health. I'm not the world's best PvE player, but on route level 107, she took me quite a few tries. The Black Knife Tish ashes that she drops read Tish was one of the assassins who on the night of the plot imbued her black knife with the rune of death and slew Godwyn the Golden. She was the daughter of the Black Knife ringleader, Alecto, and was killed protecting her mother during their flight from the royal capital. I could probably write a full essay on this boss's combat, but she certainly gives meaning to get good. Gallstone Dragon Doula. As with Royal Knight Loretta, this mighty dragon could have been included in the repeat section, but it had enough new moves along with the story aspect I gave it this unique entry. As noted by the Moonblade spell this beast drops upon defeat, Doula, a devourer of sorcerers, was bested by Ranni and subsequently swore a knightly oath to her dark moon. This monster originally roams the Three Sisters subregion of Liurnia before relocating to the Moonlight Altar upon taking enough damage. One of the most beautiful looking encounters in the game, with the moon and comet streaks elegantly and gently lighting the battlefield, Erdtree just peeking through the background as Doula casts a variety of devastating magic, including some crystal ice darts, a large diving sword attack, and the typical icy dragon breath, dealing some devastating frostbite damage along the way. While similar to the flying dragon Agheel encounter, fighting these majestic creatures via torrent zipping around the battlefield is an addition to the franchise that is more than welcome. Red Wolf of Radagon. This is a boss that's tough to judge in retrospect, as you encounter him a few times throughout the game, perhaps diminishing the original appeal a bit, but the first meeting is a fantastic battle as this magnificent red fox mixes in swirling strikes with his curved sword, diving strikes with his head, and the highlight of the fight, the casting of magic as he dashes around the arena. As a common theme mentioned throughout this video, the best bosses have the right tweaking of aggressiveness balanced against windows they leave for counterattacks, along with their health, defense, and attack damage. We should keep in mind this is all extremely difficult to do in an open world setting where players may encounter certain areas at radically different rune levels with a large variety of weapons, spells, and builds, never mind the massive differences in player skill level. All that taken into account, the contrast of the red wolf against the bluest magic not only looks fantastic, but the combat is excellently balanced as well. Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. This encounter is Fool's Idol from Demon Souls meets Deacons of the Deep from Dark Souls 3, and in Phase 2 transitions into a pretty damn good magic boss. Magic bosses are notoriously difficult to calibrate properly, but Rennala does a pretty damn good job of making a casting boss feel well balanced. Phase 1 most likely isn't gonna knock anyone's socks off combat-wise, but I think it was included more as a story element, as Rennala's great rune reads, "Children born anew by Rennala are all frail and short-lived, imperfect beings each and all." In addition, Rennala's Remembrance says, "In her youth, Rennala was a prominent champion who charmed the Academy with her lunar magic, becoming its master. She also led the Gallstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty." Phase 2 is where this battle shines, as we get the absolutely beautiful moonlit lake. She casts a nice mix of ranged and explosion attacks as she sends out homing arrows as well as her full moon cast. The fight really becomes a spectacle once she begins summoning ashes of her own, including a Darawil clone, a dragon, and a pack of wolves. She'll even mix in an energy beam attack. My critique of the combat would be that the ashes she summons despawn too quickly, as you can more or less avoid them until they disappear, or straight up run past them and attack Rennala. Overall, the combination of the story told in Phase 1 and the combat and scenery of Phase 2 make Rennala the best boss in Liurnia. If you liked this video, please check out the Limgrave boss rankings as well as many other Soulsborne and Sekiro ranking videos, all in the description below this video. Thank you for everything. Peace.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.